Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday the 18th of August and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and this evening I'm hosting the programme from Edinburgh. First, we will look at today's coronavirus update, then I will introduce this evening's guest, and then we will have a look at the stories behind the news headlines together. First, our coronavirus update. As of 2 p.m. today, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 2,594,126 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 2,224,347 have been confirmed negative, and 369,779 have tested positive. Sadly, there are 10 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus now stands at 8,051. This number includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 324 were in hospital last night, 39 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,065,970 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination and 3,498,257 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 131,260 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that's an increase of 111 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. As it's Wednesday, we also have an update from National Records of Scotland. As at the 15th of August, 10,464 deaths have been registered in Scotland where the novel coronavirus COVID-19 was mentioned on the death certificate, according to statistics published by NRS today. In the week between the 9th and the 15th of August, 41 deaths were registered that mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate. That's a decrease of 12 deaths from the previous week. 13 deaths were of people aged under 65, 8 were people aged 65 to 74, and there were 20 deaths of people aged 75 or over. 22 of the deaths were female and 19 were male. In week 32 of the year, there were 13 fewer deaths in care homes, that's 6% below average, 102 excess deaths at home or in non-institutional settings, that's 36% above average, and 3 fewer deaths in hospitals, which is 1% below average. And that's compared to the 2015 to 2019 average. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by a good friend to the programme, Peter Curran. Peter was an HR leader in a number of major businesses and is now a writer, blogger and commentator. Peter, it has been far too long since you and I last spoke on Scotland at 7. How are you keeping this evening?
I'm keeping moderately well, I think, all things considered. I won't go into the details of my day, which was a bit bizarre, but yeah, I'm fine.
That's great to hear from you, Peter, and I'm looking forward to talking through today's news with you on the programme.
Likewise.
Our first story this evening is that apparently Scotland's net fiscal balance has weakened since last year, reflecting the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on public finances and economics in Scotland, the UK and globally, according to analysis published by Scotland's chief statistician Roger Halliday. The latest Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland, that's GERS, statistics show that the first estimate of the full impact of the pandemic on public finances. However, the final impact is not yet known, and the estimates will continue to be improved in future publications. Firstly, net fiscal balance 2020-21. This is the difference between total revenue and total public sector spending, including capital investment. The net fiscal balance, including what the report calls an illustrative geographic share of North Sea revenue, was a deficit of 22.4% of GDP, that's £36.3 billion. Excluding the same illustrative North Sea revenue was a deficit of 23.8% of GDP, that's £36.9 billion. And for the UK as a whole, it is suggested that there was a deficit of 14.2% of GDP. Next, total public sector revenue for 2020-21, including the illustrative geographic share of North Sea revenue, Scottish public sector revenue is estimated as £62.8 billion, that's 7.9% of UK revenue. Of this, £500 million was North Sea revenue. Scottish non-North Sea revenue therefore was £62.3 billion, 7.8% of UK revenue. Non-North Sea public sector revenue fell from £65.3 billion in 2019-2020, and that's a fall of 4.6% as the pandemic reduced and decreased revenue, particularly non-domestic rates, VAT and fuel duties. Scotland's illustrative geographical share of North Sea revenue was £500 million in 2020-21. That's down from 0.8 billion in 2019-2020, as the fall in the oil price during the pandemic reduced revenue. Including the illustrative geographical share of North Sea revenue, Scotland's public sector revenue is equivalent to £11,496 per person. That's £382 less than the UK average. Excluding North Sea revenue, it is £11,395 per person. That's £477 less than the UK average. And total public sector expenditure for 2020-21, total expenditure for the benefit of Scotland by the Scottish Government, UK Government and all other parts of the public sector is said to be £99.2 billion. Spending increased by 21%, reflecting the costs of the health and wider economic interventions in the response to the pandemic. This is equivalent to 9.1% of total UK public expenditure, or £18,144 per person in Scotland, and that's £1,828 per person, greater than the UK average. Scotland's Finance and Economy Secretary Kate Forbes said, "The GERS figures reflect Scotland's position within the UK, under which 40% of the spending and 70% of the revenue income is reserved to the UK government. The pandemic has clearly demonstrated the need for fiscal reform and that the Scottish Government's financial powers are insufficient to deal with the new economic reality." So, Peter, first of all, I suspect that you're a little sceptical about the GERS reporting overall. Why is that?
Well, I don't start from a position of scepticism. I remind myself that these figures are produced by reputable statisticians and they're actually put out under the auspices of the Scottish Government. I mean, I go onto the Scottish Government site, Government Go UK, they are quoting the GERS figures. So I don't start from a position of attacking the GERS figures themselves. Kate Forbes, I think, you've got a nutshell on it. You've got to see the thing in context. But I do start from a few, if you like, a priori assumptions. One, that any statement that says Scotland, with all its natural resources, all its history, all its expertise in science, the quality of its people, its educational institutions, including financial institutions, cannot stand alone successfully as an independent company, must be nonsense. So I start from that position. That's not an oversimplification. The bulk of the critics from it start from a blatantly obvious point. SB UK, Scottish Business UK. If you read that title, you would think this is a reasonably objective organisation. It's not. Here's one of the quotes from their site, which I mentioned earlier. "If you share our belief that breaking up the UK is bad for Scotland and its economy, please register." So, Scottish Business UK, we know exactly where you stand. I don't share your belief. I share your belief that membership of the Union is bad for Scotland. But I do try for a bit more objectivity than you display, Scottish Business UK. So that's one A. Secondly, I think many nationalists adopt a mode of criticism to it, One of denying the validity of the figures, and we've had examples of that today in the National, uh, or challenging the estimates made. After all, these are all based on estimates. Therefore, by definition, they must be wrong because anybody south of the Mason-Dixon line must be lying. Or even the ridiculous, I hope it may be a tongue-in-cheek comment of the National correspondent today, to say that JERS was specially selected as an acronym to demonstrate the bias of the JERS system and to celebrate the Rangers football team. Well, if that had been a joke, it's a pretty lame one, but I suspect they were deadly serious. So that kind of argument doesn't help anybody. Kate Forbes put it in a nutshell. Every country in the world now has faced massive disruption to their economy due to COVID, massive bills as a result of that, deficits that they never hoped to have or incur, an imbalance between expenditure and revenue. And that's not the end of it. The fact is, the cost of achieving net zero in emissions, which is going to be the big subject of the COP conference in October, is going to impose another massive burden. However, the economics of the union, when it suits them, are the economics either of Mr. Micawber or, more accurately, Margaret Thatcher and the Grantham tea room. You know, that you must balance your budget as if you were a sweetie shop in the corner of the Royal Mile. Economics doesn't operate like that. The theory of money doesn't operate like that. The wealth of the nation is the wealth of the effort of the people, and the effectiveness of the nation and its government is the degree to which that powerful resource is harnessed and focused and adequately expressed in economic theory, taxation theory, and money management. So, yes, in the last analysis, the JERS are simply a reflection of how badly the union has served it, because the JERS reflect Scotland's economy under the union. So that's really sum total of what I have to say about JERS.
Thanks, Peter. Uh, Taking all of that on board, do you think that there is anything of substance that can be taken from JERS reporting every year?
Yes, this is what I start from the assumption that unless somebody's lying in their teeth or deliberately manipulating the thing, then what's happening is we're getting statistics that reflects the present situation, a snapshot of where we were in the last year, and that's what we have to deal with. But that's simply a statement of where we're at and what we have to do to alter it. So I don't think there's any point in this dissection of the JERS. I think it's a false focus. By all means, Kate Forbes is going to have to manage these things, as UK is going to have to manage its deficits and every other country in the world. But you do that by adapting to the circumstances of the time. All of us are going to have to cut our cloth to suit the new reality. And it's going to be a painful process. And unless Scots can face up to that squarely, as the rest of the world's going to have to be living in a false premise, I don't think JERS matters all that much, quite frankly.
Well, that's a very good point, Peter. And one final question on this point: if I say it's a false focus, and if it doesn't really matter in that sense, why do you think the Scottish Government continues to publish JERS each year?
Because they have to know where they're at. I mean, these figures exist. I mean, they weren't created. These are realities that exist of revenue in, revenue out. There's no economy in the world doesn't chart its revenue. It doesn't chart it to engage in the bear baiting sport of saying this proves you're a totally incompetent country. I think the JERS figures, properly viewed and objectively viewed, if we had any adult politicians on the union side of the argument, could be the source of a very intelligent debate, including, crucially, how are we going to manage this situation in the unique and challenging financial circumstances we're in. So I think it's natural that the figures should be published. The idea that the Scottish Government should not publish the figures because we don't want you to see them, well, we know what would be done with that. God knows the Scottish Government is secretive enough in a whole range of things. We don't want to add to that and place another dent in their much wanted claim of transparency. And on Jairs, they are transparent, and so they should be.
Thanks, Peter. We're turning now to the other major story of the day, and the Westminster Parliament was recalled, and in the House of Commons, SNP Westminster leader Ian Blackford MP said that the UK has a moral and ethical responsibility to all Afghans who worked with UK forces, and he asked the UK government to make a commitment to remove them to safety. Mr Blackford condemned the UK government's hostile attitude to refugees and the hateful anti-refugee bill, which he said would rip up international conventions, and he called on the UK government to adopt the far more ambitious and generous Afghan Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme. Priti Patel appeared to confirm that there would be no exception made for those fleeing the Taliban who used so-called irregular routes to come to the UK, saying people allowed to resettle in Britain would have to come through one of two schemes. Afghans seeking refuge in the UK who arrive on small boats from across the Channel will be treated the same as any other migrants who enter the country by those same means, the Home Secretary has suggested. Reuters, meanwhile, are reporting that at least 3 people were killed in anti-Taliban protests in the Afghan city of Jalalabad today, as the Taliban are attempting to create a government, while Western countries have continued to ramp up evacuations from a chaotic Kabul airport. Witnesses said that the deaths in Jalalabad took place when local residents tried to install Afghanistan's national flag at a square in the city, some 150 kilometres from the capital on the main road to Pakistan. About 5,000 diplomats, security staff, aid workers and Afghans have been evacuated from Kabul in the last 24 hours, according to a Western official. The evacuations by military flights will continue around the clock, he said, adding that clearing the chaos outside the airport was a challenge. Afghan women and girls who have won freedoms that they could not have dreamt of 20 years ago are desperate not to lose them now the Taliban are back in power. Taliban leaders have offered reassurances that women and girls would have the right to work and education, although those assurances have come with caveats. Some women have already been ordered from their jobs during the chaos of Taliban advances across the country in recent days. Others are fearful that whatever the militants say, the reality may be different. Times have changed, said one woman who runs a school for girls in Afghanistan, adding, "The Taliban are aware they can't silence us, and if they shut down the internet, the world will know in less than 5 minutes. They will have to accept who we are and what we have become." So, Peter, there's a lot to cover in this very quickly developing story. So first of all, to the House of Commons, what are your reflections on the debate there today? Who stood out for you, who stood out for you, or who made you cringe or your blood boil?
Nobody made me cringe or my blood boil. Some of them made me want to vomit. For sheer noisy-making, emotional, quivering lip hypocrisy, some of the speeches took some beating. And it's mirrored the whole media approach to it. There is a genuine, terrifying and horrific human crisis here. And the human crisis is inevitable. When a country has been, to all intents and purposes, occupied by a foreign power, however benevolent they claim to have behaved, and I think much of what they did and good people did was positive. But to think that this is going to go past with minimum disruption and everybody say, oh, well, the Taliban's won, we'll just have to readapt to Sharia law and the burqa, and, well, it looks as if our education's over and having any job other than a menial one suitable to a woman. Yeah, you can paint all of that picture. I start from the position that the Taliban's record is a word I don't use lightly, but is evil. I mean, the Taliban behaved appallingly. They behaved like essentially what they were, a set of medieval lords engaged in an extreme interpretation of their national religion, Islam. And Islam must be the most misinterpreted religion in the world in that respect. So I am not in the least naive or starry-eyed trusting of the Taliban. But the Taliban are now in a position they have never been in before. They are going to form the government of the country, the independent Islamic nation of Afghanistan, which it was before, the independent Islamic nation of Afghanistan. What we have here is a difference in interpretation of Islam and Sharia law within Islam. Now, we have Western values, for lack of a better word, and the Enlightenment brought huge changes to the world's values. But the rest of the world didn't proceed at the same pace and in the same way. And it's very easy to forget how brief a period in historical time ago we were mirroring, not the same extremes, but some of the behaviors of the Taliban. I mean, women in Britain only had the full franchise 7 years before I was born. I know, an old man. I mean, that is into the second quarter of the 20th century. In industry, and I've been in industry for a hell of a lot of years, I would live through the period when it was not considered credible that a woman would be, except in certain kinds of industries, an executive director or a senior manager. I worked for a major company, Scottish and Newcastle Breweries, which at one point didn't have equal pay, where you would never find a woman above a certain grade in the company, except in very rare situations. At one point during my midlife, the only woman who was on senior management in Scottish on the highest grade happened to be in personnel, because personnel was trying to lead the way in these things and break the glass ceiling. Equal pay for women only came in my midlife. I was a middle-aged man before equal pay came in. I was managing in human resources. So we forget how recent it is what we've done. Now, I don't want to see these women lose what they have. But the reality is, it's the new, we'll call it the new Afghanistan nation under the leadership it now has, which is not going to go away, that has to resolve that. We have, I say we in the sense of the West, America and Britain, have infantilized the Afghan population. That they were dependent on this external force. It's like a science fiction series where a country is in a state of misery and suddenly these benevolent aliens descend upon them and do a whole lot of good things. They also do a whole lot of bad things at the same time. Let me give you one example of this. The American embassy in, I'm not sure where, maybe Kabul or maybe, but it's probably Kabul, is the most fortified building on the globe. It cost $800 million. Now, if we're talking about doing good, imagine the good that $800 million would have done if it was simply put in an envelope in aid to Afghanistan to help shift their mind. I wouldn't have minded if they'd even bribed the Taliban intelligently. But let's face it, the British Empire ran for a hell of a long time, including right up to now into the 20th century, of discreetly placed bribes. I won't go into how you get a seat in the Lords, etc. So this idea that we have a moral superiority, yes, I would say unashamedly, some of the things the Taliban did, I find them intolerable. But it's another thing to say, because we disapprove of the moral standards of the state of democratic and moral and societal development a nation has reached, that we have the right to go in and shift it. We've certainly the right to express disapproval, to regulate our dealings with them diplomatically in terms of trade, to offer help, and to say certain kinds of help and trade deals will not be made unless they want. We do not have the right to put military boots on the ground. So I think I'm not saying we should give the Taliban the benefit of the doubt. Negotiation, which is my game, and forgive me for going on so long about it, negotiation is, in a real sense, morals free. It's not entirely ethically free, but it's morals free. Every day, every hour of every day across the globe, key negotiations take place in which both sides are prepared to kill the other side at the initial meeting of the negotiation. And one side of that negotiation is actively and violently criminal, and the other side is a bit like, I'm talking about drug deals. And yet they negotiate. As a negotiator, I had to negotiate with people and companies and individuals that I didn't like, I didn't share their philosophy of life. It's still the job of reaching agreement. The West, in total, America, Britain, and every other country in the world has to establish an intelligent working relationship with the new Taliban government. That doesn't mean being naive, not playing hardball, but for God's sake, don't entertain the thought that you're going to have another military misadventure in that country.
Thanks, Peter. That was an outstanding extemporization on the topic, and I'm very grateful to you. Thank you. We'll move on to our next story now, and that is that the Duke of York is considered a person of interest in the US investigation into the disgraced late financier Jeffrey Epstein and his girlfriend Ghislaine Maxwell, it has been claimed. An unnamed source said to be close to the police inquiry told the Reuters news agency that investigators viewed Prince Andrew as a person of interest over his friendship with Epstein as part of their investigation into possible co-conspirators. Representatives from the Duke's legal team have refused to comment. Investigators have previously said that they wish to speak to Andrew as a potential witness. Last week, Virginia Roberts Goffre, who has alleged that she was trafficked and abused by Epstein, filed a civil complaint against Prince Andrew in Manhattan Federal Court. Goffre alleges Andrew forced her to have unwanted sex at Maxwell's London home and in the US on 3 occasions when she was aged 17. Andrew has denied those allegations. The phrase person of interest is a term used by law enforcement for someone who has not been arrested or formally accused of any crime. It has no legal meaning, but it is understood it can refer to someone who may have information that would assist the investigation, including as a potential witness. Prosecutors investigating sex trafficking allegations against Epstein and his associates have previously sought Andrew's cooperation and have accused him of repeatedly stonewalling and declining requests to schedule any interview with federal authorities. Last year, prosecutors sent the UK government a formal request, known as a Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty Submission, asking for access to the Duke so that they could talk to him. So, Peter, what strikes you first about Prince Andrew's apparent approach to these allegations and the developments in the case?
What strikes me is that it's entirely consistent with being a royal, and it's exactly what I would have expected of him and the royals standing behind him. I don't find any. I'm a Republican, and the whole basis of royal families, unless they're a constitutional monarchy selected with no relationship whatsoever to birth or family, and kept in their proper place as a sort of idealized family. That can work, and it does work in Scandinavian and Nordic countries. But you've got to look at why the Windsors are there. The Windsors had a different name before, and they had to change it recently because of the German involvements in the war. Took certain tenuous but quite firm links of birth. A royal family in Britain is there because they believe they are anointed by God, which in practice in this case means the Church of England, in perpetuity to rule over the rest of it, and their heirs and successors in perpetuity. Indeed, the Scottish Parliament in its formation actually, and Alexander actually accepted that phraseology in my recollection. So they have to be this idealized family. Unfortunately, the behaviour of the Windsors, and their history has been exhaustively tracked and traced recently, does not bear close scrutiny in a whole series of it. I'm old enough to remember as a child the smell of the scandal of Mrs. Simpson and Edward VIII and all that went with that. Uh, so what they are doing is presenting untold riches. Now, I have to take a position. I would say anybody of my generation who's old enough to have experienced the war as thinking, even as a child, has an affection for the Queen. We remember her as a child, we remember her as a young woman, we remember her in the tragedy of the death of her father. And I think the Queen is a decent woman. But that monarchy doesn't exist by the fiat of the Windsors or the Archbishop of Canterbury. It exists because of a whole conglomeration of an establishment ranging from Oxbridge, from Eton schools, from titled people. I once did an analysis of the British monarchy in my blog. It's still up there. And the order of precedence goes down, down and down. These are people who theoretically, ultimately could be heirs to the throne. And there was, I think her name was Mrs. Shackerley Ackers, who was something like 560. And this sort of stuff is, forgive the Roman phrase, it's got borrowed from the Ninth Legion, it's utter bollocks in the 21st century. It's always been bollocks. So I expect Andrew to be, I have no idea whether he's guilty or not. I'll leave that to the law. What is for certain is the Queen sure as hell is rich enough to muster any defence that he needs. Whether she should or not is another matter. But I can make no judgments on his guilt or innocence, and on the Windsors. The only judgment I can make is I don't think a lot of monarchy in general, and I don't think a lot of the Windsors in particular.
Thanks, Peter. We'll move on to our next story now. The SNP has said that Boris Johnson must not break his manifesto commitment by cutting the triple lock on pensions, warning that pensioner poverty is already on the rise under the Tory government. It follows reports today that the Treasury is drawing up plans to break the triple lock and cut the planned increase in pensions to below the increase in average earnings. David Linden MP said the UK already has the lowest state pension of any country in North West Europe by comparison to pre-retirement wages, and that pensioner poverty has risen further under the Tory government after a decade of Tory austerity cuts. The SNP's Shadow Work and Pensions spokesperson said that the only way to keep pensioners safe from Tory cuts is for Scotland to become an independent country, with the full powers needed to protect and improve the incomes of pensioners. Analysis from the House of Commons Library, using OECD data, has revealed UK pensions are the least generous of every country in North West Europe. UK pensioners receive just over a quarter, 28%, of the average working wage when they retire, lower than all 13 neighbouring countries, including Ireland at 36%, Norway at 52%, Finland at 64%, Iceland at 70%, France at 74%, Austria and Luxembourg at 90%. The UK government's own households below average income statistics show that UK pensioner poverty levels are on the rise, with 2.1 million or 18% of pensioners living in poverty after housing costs. And that's an increase of 200,000 people on 2018-19 and is a 15-year high. Now, Peter, you may have to declare an interest here, but that's absolutely okay.
Well, I've got several interests. One, I have an occupational pension. And secondly, I have pensions that I set up in my own right when I went into business. So I have private pension schemes.
Of course, of course.
That's the interest I have. But let me just what about the statistics you quoted latterly. First of all, it's a matter of absolute fact. But as compared to other nations, our pensions are derisory. And one key measure of a nation is how much it cares for its pensioners, for the people that work for the nation for a large part of their life and paid taxes. However, I have to say, and some may not like me saying this, any government, and it will apply to the Scottish independent government when we have one, has to make a decision in times of financial crisis. Are all the commitments that it made before the financial crisis come along sustainable? And pensions cannot be separate from that. So I don't challenge Boris and Rishi Sunak's right to reassess all elements of public expenditure. It's a question of what they choose to spend their money on. And we know that what they choose to spend their money on is not an admirable choice of priority. You've only got to look at Trident to take one example of the ludicrous suggestion that we should have another Royal yacht, or aircraft carriers at one point were patrolling the seas without aircraft. The amount we spend in status symbols, the amount we spend on, somebody can always produce percentage and says it only costs you tuppence halfpenny to keep the Queen in the Royal Family. It doesn't work like that. So I don't think the triple lock probably cannot survive, but it's what's put in its place and what reviews are put in its place. And meanwhile, I don't think the Scottish Government can do anything but protest against breach of the commitment. But like everything else, and as I've said in many previous editions of Scotland at 7, we can criticise the UK and the Union till the cows come home, but we're not having any significant or major influence. It will not shift its key priorities because Scotland says so. In fact, you might argue at the moment, the present government and regime we have, it will not shift any priority if Scotland asks for it to be shifted. So what can I say? We are entering a period of unprecedented financial pressure, and I hope pensioners are given the due priority. Priority above buying lordships and doling out money to friends, making people rich by giving them dubious COVID contracts. There's huge scandals, huge amounts of money. Let's cream all that crap and, frankly, it's corruption off and pump a proportion of that towards the pensioners. But by all means, review.
Thanks, Peter. Our next story is that drivers who put others at risk by drug driving will be the focus of a campaign over the next few weeks. Road policing officers will be focusing attention on suspected drug drivers as part of a national campaign to tackle drug driving and to improve road safety. The public awareness campaign runs between 16 and 22 August, with an enforcement operation being carried out between 23rd August and the 29th. During the summer drink and drug drive campaign in early July, officers conducted 75 roadside drug tests, as well as 427 roadside breath tests, which resulted in 156 drink and drug driving offences being reported. Out of the 156 offences reported, 66 related to drink driving offences, 41 related to driving a vehicle with a drug over the prescribed limit, 17 related to driving a vehicle whilst unfit through drink or drugs, and 32 drivers failed to comply with the requirement to provide a sample. Police Superintendent Simon Bradshaw said, "We have sadly seen time and again that people are willing to risk driving under the influence or over the limit of drugs, and it is simply unacceptable. Roadside drug testing has been in place for almost 2 years, and road policing officers are detecting drug driving offences far too regularly. The purpose of this campaign is to raise awareness of the drug limits in place and to highlight the dangers that drug driving brings. Drug or drink driving can and does have fatal consequences, which should be enough of a deterrent. If convicted of such an offence, you could go to jail, lose your job and your driving licence, and be given a fine." Now, Peter, the figures that I quoted from Police Scotland there, around 500 roadside drug or drink tests in the last campaign, and more than a quarter of those tests lead to reports to the Procurator Fiscal. In this day and age, what do you think's going on?
I don't know. Is the truth. I've got my cough sweet back in. Have a drink of water.
It's no bother.
Same story when I get passionately involved in a topic, Andrew, that sets me coughing. Let me try and find a mix here between the deadly serious and the light-hearted, because God knows we all need a laugh these days. It's a bleak world. I'm aware of the fact that humour can appear to trivialise a subject. I don't want to do that. First of all, I never drove any motor vehicle till I was in my mid-20s, and it was a motorcycle. And I certainly never let an iota of alcohol cross my lips, not because I was in fear of the police, because I was in fear of my life. I was having enough trouble to staying alive on the bike, stone cold sober. But I didn't actually drive a car till I was 38. I didn't want to drive. I had my life ordered in a race. And I suppose I tolerated drunken driving in a sense because as a part-time musician, I used to be driven to gigs in the arts and parts by somebody else. And musicians, on balance, have a certain fondness for alcohol, and these days sometimes for other substances. And I've been driven back from gigs by somebody who said, "Can you tell me what's on the road?" And said, "The driver, tell me what's on the road in front of me, Peter, and when the lights are at green or red, because I can't see a bloody thing." Now, at the time, I accepted that. I'm appalled at that mature age that I could accept that for my convenience. I was afraid. I didn't like it, but I accepted it. Now, I think we know better. We all must know better when we see the awful statistics. Driving under the influence of alcohol, regardless of your own belief and your own rationalization that I'm all right driving, some even arguing they're better, is what American criminal law calls reckless endangerment. And I think the penalty should be harsh, speedy, and almost draconian. I don't think we should be giving any quarter to somebody because you're saying, yes, you got away with it this time, but you could have killed somebody's child. So I applaud the police for doing this, but I don't really know what's going on. I still feel that somewhere in our culture and our collective psyche in Scotland, there is a tolerance for alcohol which should not exist. And it runs all the way. May I say, I think I'm safely free of any charges of libel. I once played periodically with a procurator fiscal, a member of the procurator fiscal's office, who drank and drove. And he would sit at the gate doing calculations about his body weight and the dissipation rate of alcohol in the bloodstream according to his weight in per milligrams of alcohol. And a lot of people are doing that at the moment. I once went to in a company, not in Scotland, which I worked with, to a hosted event the company had for the police. And we had very senior police officers, and it was held in a brewery. And they got blitzed out of their mind. And I said, "How are you going to cope with it? Surely you're not going to drive." And he said, "No, no, we've brought our driver with us." And the driver came in who'd been refreshing himself liberally in the brewer's bar, and if anything was more blitzed out of his mind than the police, senior policeman, his boss, went out and drove him home. It's that kind of mindset. It's a sort of macho mindset. I don't say women don't abuse alcohol, but I think they have a bit more sense when it comes to driving. There's something wrong with the male psyche, and it has to be. So I just support the police in anything they do, and I can think of no policy that would be too draconian for me to say, "Hold on a minute, don't be so harsh."
Understood, Peter. Thank you. That's a good thing. Close
The
of
sound's
five.
breaking up, Andrew.
It has been confirmed that the National 5 higher and advanced higher exams will be held in spring 2022, if public health advice allows. The decision has been informed by public health advice and by the views of partners, including those in the National Qualifications Group, which includes representatives of young people, parents, teachers, and other education professionals. course content has been reduced compared to a normal year to take account of the disruption to learning that young people have experienced. These modifications have already been confirmed by the SQA. Due to uncertainty over the pandemic, two contingency plans will be in place. If there is further significant disruption to learning as a result of COVID-19, but it is still safe for the exams to go ahead, there may be further modifications to courses and to assessment. If public health conditions do not allow for an exam diet to take place, awards will be made on teachers' judgments based on normal in-year assessment. So, Peter, do you think that this announcement suggests perhaps that the education authorities are finally starting to get a proper grip on running examinations during a pandemic?
Well, it's arguable, given the record of the Scottish Qualifications Authority, that they didn't have too sound a grip of it before the pandemic struck. We've had embarrassing scandals there before, and we can speculate on the reasons for that. I grew up in the era where the Scottish education system was the envy of the world and the cynosure of neighbouring eyes. And it certainly is not these days. But I think, again, it's easy to pontificate after the event on how people respond to an unprecedented challenge. And in the lifetime of most administrators and professionals and citizens, the COVID emergency, there's been nothing like it. I mean, there's nothing like it in my lifetime except the Second World War, where suddenly you had a highly regulated state and you weren't allowed to live life as you would want it to. And if people think they're having a hard time now, they should have lived during the key periods of austerity early in the war, and indeed in some of the post-Second World War austerity of the late 40s into the 50s. So I think they are showing good sense in this. The worrying thing, and I think it's the thing that worries everybody, is what is a qualification meant to do, and what is an examination meant to do? And indeed, an even harder question, are examinations the right way to measure something? And as somebody who's spent a significant part of my life in recruitment and selection, which is a skill subset of human resource management, which is a vitally important thing, because you can do nothing unless you attract the right kind of people to apply to you, to work with you, and you have a selection method that helps. But one of the key things in the selection method, especially of new entrants, was what we called the milk round. So all major companies, or virtually all major companies, before university exams have taken place, before the final degrees, actually go around the big universities and invite people who are studying for a degree and close to undergraduates, close to a degree, to come on assessment weekends with the companies. Now I've run these things at the Gosford Park Hotel in Newcastle and dealt with all the bright-eyed. But the qualification they had, actually, it only had relevance as to whether you invited them to come at all. You looked at a whole range of other things, including psychometric tests we did, how the person performed in structured tests and case studies and environments, how they interacted with each other. There are certain disciplines in life and professions that you must have a qualification and it must be ratified and verified at the highest level. Medicine's the obvious one, the crucial services are the other, the law, etc. I think to some degree we've become over emphasis on qualification. I left school at 15 before I'd sat the third year leaving certificate because my birthday was at the half year and that's the way it worked out. In today's world, I wouldn't have had any career at all. I wouldn't have got off the ground. And I would have, with luck, been able to study evening classes and maybe build something. So I think we can overemphasize it. But we do understand that people don't want the Scottish hire, to take one example, which did have a certain gold standard to be devalued. But we have to recognise that employers are going to look askance at the qualifications that were issued under these altered circumstances. And they shouldn't. What they should say is they are what they are, and we'll buttress perhaps our certain doubts about how big they should bulk in the selection process by beefing up our own selection process. Too many companies regard the schools and universities as simply a machine line who pumps people out in a production line for the purpose of industry. They're not there for that. We're there to give them an education, to make them a fully fledged citizen. So I think that balance has to be got right. But I certainly wouldn't be critical of these measures. I think they make as much sense as anything can in the uncertain world of the pandemic.
Thanks, Peter. Staying with education for a moment, the temporary COVID recovery funding of £80 million that helped to recruit 1,400 teachers and 250 support staff is to be made permanent. From April 2022, the sum will be allocated annually to the local government settlement. This will allow local authorities to offer sustained employment to additional teachers and support staff, while meeting local needs and benefiting Scotland's children and young people. This is in addition to the £65.5 million permanent additional funding announced on the 9th of August for local authorities to recruit a further additional 1,000 teachers and 500 support staff. It will also be allocated annually from 2022 onwards. So, Peter, briefly, do you think that we should add more money every year to a list of things which should be done to give more support to young people in their education?
Well, if you ask about any area of government expenditure, Andrew, you can say it deserves more. I mean, this, if you think, is the modus operandi of the Lib Dems, Tories, and Labour in the Parliament. They focus on one issue and demand that it receive massive priority resources, or even one incident within one area of expenditure. Now, anybody can play that game. It's a question, what we have to do is get our scale of priority across the range of things that government has to do sorted out. Where do we see the role of education? Where do we see the role of protecting pensions? Where do we see the role of health? Where do we see the vital role of protecting our vital services? Where do we see the role of housing? We have to have some kind of, not a rule of thumb, but intelligently judged and perhaps reassessed periodically of which trumps the other. There was a guy called the Marquis de Condorcet in sometime in the dim and distant past who conceived a way of judging things by a process of outranking. A outranks B and B outranks C, therefore A outranks C. We have to get our priorities right. And our priorities always must be, I'm not giving an order, but they must include the areas I've talked about: health, medicine, how we cope with the vulnerable, how we educate our children, how we fund science, and how we fund science where there is no obvious return. I mean, the space program is regarded as madness by most Americans and by many people in the world. Why do they do it? Why the hell do they want to fly a rocket? The payback in technological developments forced by the process of sending a rocket into space and bringing it back have been of untold benefit. The miniaturization. So we have to be prepared to do things because scientific inquiry is good in its own. And we should remember that the universities function best when they're not seen as factories to meet the needs of the society. They're done best by allowing them to marshal their intellect and pursue the areas they think are relevant. But there's difficult funding decisions to be made within that. But I think everything is in a state of flux at the moment. And thank God, Kate Forbes does impress me in this respect as having that sort of quiet financial competence and insight that means she's the right person in the right job. So at least I'm reassured on that account of the Scottish Government.
Great, thanks, Peter. And our final story this evening is that the poet and essayist Kathleen Jamie, who was raised in Curry to the west of Edinburgh, has been appointed as Scotland's next Macker. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon formally welcomed her to her role at the Scottish Poetry Library in Edinburgh today. the role of Macker involves taking a leadership role in promoting poetry nationally, as well as producing work relating to significant national events. Ms Jamie was appointed by the First Minister for a 3-year term on the recommendation of an expert panel representing Scotland's literary sector. While the idea of a Macker probably dates back as far as King James I and his King's Quair, Kathleen is the 4th person to hold this precise role since it was established by the Scottish Parliament in 2004. She follows in the footsteps of Jackie Kay, Liz Lochhead and Edwin Morgan. The First Minister said, "I am delighted to confirm Kathleen Jamie as our national poet. Poetry is integral to Scotland's culture and history. The Macker has a central role in celebrating that legacy and preserving its future by encouraging the next generation of young writers to leave their mark." And so, Peter, finally for today, what's your reaction to the appointment this afternoon of a new Macker for Scotland?
Well, deep personal embarrassment in the fact that I've never heard of her. And that is entirely down to me. I had planned over a decade ago to spend my retirement catching up with my early interest in literature and poetry in my early life, which got swept away by reading technical manuals and writing boring minutes and trying to assimilate economic things. And in point of fact, I got caught up in the whole thing again by my support for independence. So I thought I have to, before on the programme tonight, see something by this woman. Bear with me, I'm not a great deliverer of poetry, but I've lost my bit, but you'll just have to wait because that's what I want to show you.
There we go.
Right, here we go. Listen to this. Take my specs up. On the civic amenity landfill site, the cout they dump beyond the cemetery, and the 30-mile-an-hour sign are stiff old ladies' bags, open-mouthed, spew postcards sent from small Scots towns. And 1960s Peebles, Largs, the rock gardens of Carnoustie, tinted in the dirt. Mr. and Mrs. Scotland, here is the hand you were dealt. Fair but cool, showery but nevertheless, Jean asks kindly, the lovely scenery. In careful schoolroom crypt, the Beltane Queen was crowned today, but Mr. and Mrs. Scotland are dead. Anybody who can write like that, for me, richly deserves to be a Macker, and I will be buying this woman's work and cursing myself for not knowing about it a long time ago.
Thank you, Peter. We all have the chance now to catch up on Kathleen Jamie's work, and I think we're all looking forward, especially given the accent and the way in which she uses language. I think we're all looking forward to reading more of her work, both that she's already published and that will be published during her 3 years as the Macker for Scotland.
And we must make time for poetry. We must make time for literature.
Absolutely,
I know the
spot
First
on.
Minister has an addiction to repetitive whodunits. And I should say that all due respect to the two people we know, but there is a dimension beyond a rehash of Agatha Christie plots and drawing room denouements. I think we have
Absolutely right. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
And that is the news in Scotland at 7 this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now, and we will be extremely grateful. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website, www.broadcastingscotland.scot, and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be back tomorrow at 7 o'clock with the next edition of Scotland at 7, presented by Rebecca. So please join us and please tune in and join us then. I'd like also to say very many thanks to Peter for joining us this evening and sharing his thoughts and wisdom and experience.